On March 6, 1944, at an altitude of approximately 28,000 feet above Brandenburg, Germany, Major Hans Kogler peered through the canopy of his Messerschmitt Bf 109-6, his oxygen mask frosting over in the frigid air. He led a mixed group of Luftwaffe fighters, following instructions from ground control to intercept what was reported as an unprotected bomber formation at this depth within German territory. Suddenly, a warning cut sharply through his radio. American single-engine fighters bearing drop tanks were sighted at 12 o'clock high. Kogler froze. American fighters should not have been capable of reaching this far into the Reich. Even the most optimistic range assessments placed them well short of Berlin. The P-47 Thunderbolt, for example, had a combat radius that barely penetrated German airspace. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning could reach targets like Hanover under favorable conditions, but Brandenburg, let alone Berlin itself, was beyond its operational envelope. The appearance of these aircraft defied every assumption and defensive calculation the Luftwaffe had relied upon since the inception of the American daytime bombing offensive. As Kogler observed the advancing formations, he recognized the unmistakable silhouettes, the long, slender wings and squared tips of North American P-51B Mustangs. Unlike earlier encounters with Thunderbolts and Lightnings, these fighters had ample fuel and altitude, granting them freedom to engage with calculated patience and tactical superiority. That day, the 8th Air Force was sending 730 heavy bombers toward Berlin. Unlike previous raids, which often diverted to secondary targets after approaching the capital, this operation aimed directly at the core of the Third Reich. For the first time in aerial warfare history, single-engine fighters would escort bombers to their objective and back, demonstrating a previously unachievable combination of range, endurance, and combat effectiveness. Unknown to Kogler and his group of 7 twin-engine Me-110s and Bf-110s, this engagement marked the onset of an unprecedented psychological crisis within the Luftwaffe. The looming threat extended beyond mere aircraft losses. It struck at the foundation of German confidence in air superiority, a belief that had remained largely unchallenged since 1939. The equations of destruction were being inscribed not in ministry offices, but across the high-altitude sky in the contrails of Mustang formations. Early indications of this shift had appeared weeks earlier, though senior Luftwaffe officials largely dismissed them. On January 11, 1944, Major Hermann Graf of JG-11 reported encounters with American single-engine fighters near Brunswick, nearly 150 miles deeper into Germany than their range should have allowed. Graf speculated that these aircraft might have refueled its secret Swedish airfields, but Berlin attributed his report to combat stress impairing judgment. Yet sightings continued to accumulate. Hanover on January 29th, Magdeburg on February 3rd. Each observation incrementally expanded the perceived reach of American fighters, yet official statements repeatedly denied their validity. On February 15, 1944, the Reich Air Ministry issued a formal directive asserting that any reports of American single-engine fighters deep inside German territory were misidentifications of P-38 Lightnings or German aircraft. Pilots claiming otherwise were to be sent for medical assessment. The reality, however, was far more alarming. At Wright Field, Ohio, American engineers had successfully modified the P-51B Mustang, equipping it with auxiliary drop tanks that extended its combat radius to over 650 miles. From the German technical perspective, the notion of a single-engine fighter covering 1,300 miles with full combat capabilities seemed impossible. By the time the Mustangs appeared over Brandenburg, this engineering breakthrough had already redefined the strategic balance in the air. The Luftwaffe now faced a force capable of operating at ranges and with endurance that shattered every prior assumption, signaling a turning point that would fundamentally alter the course of the air war over Europe. In the early months of 1944, Hauptmann Heinznach, who led the 2nd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11, recorded in his diary a confidence that, at the time, seemed unshakable. By his account, German planners had determined with mathematical certainty that American single-engine fighters were incapable of escorting their bomber formations beyond roughly 280 miles from their English airfields. On paper, this limitation granted the Luftwaffe a vast interior arena, stretching across central and eastern Germany, where German interceptors could strike the incoming bombers without fear of Allied fighters appearing overhead. The logic appeared flawless. Fuel capacity divided by consumption defined the outer boundary of U.S. fighter operations. The Americans, so they believed, were bound by the same immutable physical constraints. What German leadership failed to anticipate, however, was not a violation of physics, but a more imaginative application of it. The decisive change came not from some secretive new airframe, but from two innovations that German intelligence either underestimated or misinterpreted entirely: the Packard-manufactured Merlin engine and the surprisingly sophisticated paper drop tanks designed in Britain. The Packard V1650-3 engine fitted into the P-51B was far more than a simple licensed adaptation of the Rolls-Royce Merlin. Using manufacturing expertise drawn from Detroit's automotive industry, Packard refined the design with extraordinarily tight machining tolerances. The result was an engine capable of delivering around 1,490 horsepower at low altitude and retaining over 1,200 horsepower even at 30,000 feet, thanks to its advanced two-stage, two-speed supercharger assembly. This level of consistent high-altitude performance stunned German evaluators. Oberfeldwebel Konrad Bauer of JG-26 examined the wreckage of a downed P-51B near Gütersloh in February 1944. His post-war discovered technical assessment reveals the depth of German surprise. Bauer described the engine installation as a model of elegant engineering, highlighting in particular an intercooler system more advanced than anything found in their own Daimler-Benz 605 engines. Even more unsettling was the uniform precision of the American components. According to the report, if it was true that U.S. factories were able to turn out several of these engines every hour, then the conflict was increasingly shaped not only by pilots and tactics, but by industrial output on a scale Germany simply could not match. Even more transformative than the engine, though, were the external fuel tanks. Crafted from layers of resin-soaked paper pressed into shape, the British-designed 108-gallon tanks weighed barely more than a crate of ammunition. Engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had learned how to create a laminated structure that could safely store fuel for roughly 5 hours before the material began to deteriorate. This lifespan was far longer than necessary for a flight from England to Berlin. German designers had experimented with auxiliary tanks as well, but their philosophy kept pushing them towards reusable metal tanks. Durable, yes, but heavy, expensive, and aerodynamically harmful. Fighters burdened with such tanks lost precious maneuverability and were easy prey. In stark contrast, the Allied paper tanks cost little, could be discarded instantly, and imposed minimal performance penalties. A P-51B equipped with 2 of these lightweight tanks could traverse the entire distance to Berlin, release the tanks moments before combat, and immediately engage German fighters with its full performance restored. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group summarized the tactical shift in a briefing from 1944. German pilots expected American escorts to conserve fuel cautiously, reserving just enough for brief engagements and the trip home. The new system upended that assumption. U.S. fighters could cruise across Europe using only the external fuel, jettison the tanks at the perimeter of the combat zone, and still retain a full internal fuel load for prolonged aggressive fighting. As Zemke put it, American pilots were no longer operating on the edge of their endurance. They had breathing room, and they used it boldly. To appreciate the psychological effect of the March 6, 1944 Berlin mission, one must recall the trauma burned into the memory of the 8th Air Force from October 14, 1943, Black Thursday. On that earlier day, U.S. forces attempted a daylight strike on the Schweinfurt ball bearing factories without the protection of long-range fighters. Of the 291 B-17 flying fortresses that ventured into German airspace, 60 were destroyed and another 138 severely damaged. The casualty count exceeded 600 airmen. The message delivered by the Luftwaffe was unmistakable. Attempting daylight bombing without escorts capable of staying with the bombers deep into Germany was suicide. By the autumn of 1943, Lieutenant General Ira Eaker, in charge of the 8th Air Force, faced a hard truth. The long-range daylight assaults deep inside Germany could no longer be sustained. Losses had become so heavy that the strategy seemed on the verge of collapse. On the German side, Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, chief of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, publicly hailed October 14th as the finest hour of Germany's air defense forces. In his memoir, The First and the Last, written after the war, he declared that the battle over Schweinfurt demonstrated the failure of American high-precision bombing during daylight. In Galland's view, the Americans would inevitably be forced to emulate the British approach: night raids, poor accuracy, and limited effect. In theory, he wrote, we had already won. But despite his tactical brilliance, Galland misread a crucial element of the conflict. He underestimated American willingness to innovate rather than surrender to the limits of current technology. Early intelligence reports hinting at a new Allied fighter with unprecedented range reached him late in 1943, yet he dismissed them as exaggerations. Even when German pilots claimed to have spotted single-engine American fighters near Hanover in January 1944, far beyond the range of any aircraft previously known, Galland brushed off the sightings as misidentifications. Reality finally struck on February 20th, 1944, the opening day of Big Week, the massive Allied air offensive intended to cripple German aircraft production. The U.S. Army Air Forces launched roughly 1,000 heavy bombers, accompanied by more than 800 escort fighters. Among them were the P-51 Mustangs, deployed in significant numbers for the first time. Over just 5 days, the Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters. More devastating than the aircraft were the pilots. About 100 veteran flyers, nearly a fifth of Germany's experienced fighter cadre, were killed. Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, Adolf's younger brother and commander within Jagdgeschwader 26, later summarized the shift. Once the Mustangs appeared, everything changed. Previously, we could wait just outside the reach of their escorts, strike the bombers at chosen moments, and disengage. Now we had to fight through the fighters simply to reach the bombers, and then fight to escape. Every sortie became a survival contest from the moment wheels left the runway. On March 6, 1944, Northern Europe awoke to cold, crisp skies, ideal conditions for aviation. At RAF Leiston, crews had worked through the night to ready the aircraft of the 357th Fighter Group. The unit was about to undertake the boldest operation yet attempted, the first full-distance escort by P-51 Mustangs all the way to Berlin. Colonel Henry Spicer gathered his pilots at 6 in the morning. His briefing was direct. "Gentlemen, we're going to Big B today, from start to finish. We expect 4 hours over hostile territory. If any aircraft has even the slightest issue, turn back now. At this range, we cannot afford a second chance." Not a single pilot stepped out. Ironically, Spicer himself was forced to abandon the mission shortly after takeoff because of mechanical trouble, leaving Major Thomas L. Hayes in command of the momentous escort. At approximately 0830, 730 heavy bombers began climbing from bases scattered across East Anglia. Behind them, nearly 800 fighters formed staggered escort layers. P-47 Thunderbolts to cover the early phase, P-38 Lightnings for the central portion, and P-51 Mustangs for the deepest segment, including the Berlin target area. The 357th put 48 Mustangs into the air, although mechanical difficulties and dense cloud formations meant only 33 ultimately reached the Berlin region. Inside Germany, Radar stations belonging to the Reich's air defense network detected the formation building over the North Sea. At Doberitz, the central control hub for Berlin's fighter defense, analysts initially suspected another American feint. The Allies had approached the capital before, only to veer away toward industrial targets in western Germany. General Johannes Steinhoff, commanding the 2nd Fighter Division responsible for Berlin's protection, studied the radar picture carefully. Believing the Americans might once again change course, he made a pivotal choice. His units would remain grounded until the bombers committed unmistakably to the capital. Fuel was precious, and he had no intention of wasting it on what might prove yet another diversion. At 11:30 a.m., the lead elements of the American bomber formations crossed into German-controlled airspace near Arnhem. Their P-47 Thunderbolt escorts immediately engaged German interceptors launching from airfields in the Netherlands and western Germany. The engagement unfolded according to the pattern the Luftwaffe had long anticipated. German pilots maintained a cautious approach, waiting for the moment when the American fighters would be forced to turn back due to fuel constraints, leaving the bombers exposed. By 12:55 p.m., as the bomber stream neared Berlin, Major Hans Kogler assembled a mixed force of German aircraft to intercept what was expected to be undefended bombers. His contingent included 7 Messerschmitt Bf-110 twin-engine fighters pressed into daytime operations and 41 Bf-109 single-engine fighters. German air controllers, observing the withdrawal of the P-47s, assumed the bombers had become vulnerable. Leading the 357th Fighter Group, Major Thomas Hayes and his 33 P-51 Mustangs had navigated difficult weather conditions to reach the Berlin area. In his combat report, Hayes described the moment the sky cleared. "We emerged above the clouds to find B-24 Liberators beneath us and slightly to our left. Simultaneously, roughly 40 enemy aircraft maneuvered into attack positions. Me-100s and 109s were present in full formation. They had no awareness of our presence. We held the altitude advantage and achieved complete tactical surprise." The German pilots, preoccupied entirely with the bomber stream, did not detect the Mustangs until it was too late. Hayes, leading the assault, radioed, "Greenhouse Squadron, this is Greenhouse Leader. Enemy fighters at 2 o'clock low, drop external tanks and engage." One surviving German pilot, Feldwebel Jan Müller of JG-11, recalled the encounter. "We were just initiating our dive on the bombers when tracer rounds streaked past my canopy. I looked up and saw single-engine fighters with American markings diving from above. Initially, I thought these must be captured planes or a ruse, but then I saw dozens of drop tanks released and realized these were real P-51s operating at a range we had never imagined possible." What followed was not a conventional dogfight, but a decisive rout. The German formation, caught off guard and poorly positioned, broke apart in disarray. Within 12 minutes, the 357th claimed 20 enemy aircraft destroyed while reporting no losses. Hayes personally downed a Bf-109 at low altitude near Velsen and led additional Mustangs in a strafing attack against a nearby German airfield. Meanwhile, at his residence in Marienhol, roughly 50 miles north of Berlin, Reich Marshal Göring was having lunch when he received a report from General Adolf Galland. American fighters were operating over Berlin. Göring initially dismissed the claim, insisting it was impossible. Galland, however, confirmed multiple eyewitness reports of P-51s engaging German aircraft over the capital. Göring reacted violently, reportedly smashing a wine glass against the wall in fury and declaring, "This is treason, sabotage. Any pilot claiming such things is lying to cover cowardice. They will be court-martialed." Yet even as he raged, the evidence was indisputable. Contrails over Berlin were visible from his estate, and the sound of high-powered engines could be heard in the distance. Observers later testified that Göring spent nearly an hour at the window, silently watching the sky. That evening, Göring issued an order that would become infamous in Luftwaffe history. Any pilot claiming to have seen American single-engine fighters over Berlin was to be arrested for cowardice and spreading defeatist propaganda. The directive caused immediate confusion and fear among German air units already struggling to cope with heavy losses. Some squadron leaders, including Major Gall, ignored the order, instructing pilots to report engagements with twin-engine aircraft to avoid repercussions. On March 8, 1944, in a meeting at the Air Ministry, General Gall presented Göring with physical proof, a fragment of a P-51 drop tank recovered near Magdeburg, clearly marked Made in USA. Göring's disbelief persisted, insisting that American fighters could not possibly reach Berlin. Nevertheless, according to Gall's memoirs, it was at this moment Göring realized that Germany's air war, and by extension the war itself, was effectively lost. He later admitted at Nuremberg, "The sight of American fighters over Berlin made it clear the outcome was inevitable." For individual Luftwaffe pilots, the arrival of Mustangs over the German capital represented more than a tactical surprise. It signaled a profound strategic and psychological shock. They had been trained to believe in the invincibility of their homeland and the superiority of German engineering. Hartmann Heinz Knacke, commander of the 2nd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11, wrote in his diary on March 7, 1944, "Yesterday changed everything. The familiar zones where we could regroup, attack, and feel secure no longer exist. If they can strike Berlin, no place is safe. We are no longer the hunters, we have become the hunted, even over our own capital." The psychological toll on the Luftwaffe intensified considerably due to the caliber of the opposition they faced. The P-51B Mustang did not merely appear over Berlin, it asserted complete aerial dominance. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine enabled a maximum speed of 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, outpacing the Bf-109 G6, which could only reach 386 miles per hour at the same altitude. Its laminar flow wing design offered superior maneuverability at high altitudes, while its 6.50 caliber machine guns delivered a devastatingly concentrated rate of fire. Perhaps most importantly, Mustang pilots were well rested, unlike their German counterparts who often flew long sorties at the limits of their endurance and fuel reserves. One German pilot, Unteroffizier Vera Priess of GG 301, recounted a March 9th encounter with these aircraft. He described how they approached from above and behind, always maintaining a height advantage. When German pilots attempted to turn and engage, the Mustangs would effortlessly climb vertically, exploiting their power to strike from any angle. Attempts to escape through dives were futile. The Americans could follow with ease. Unlike other Allied aircraft, which were constrained by fuel and often limited themselves to a single pass, Mustangs could make repeated attacks at will, descending to low altitudes and striking with relentless precision.
Johannes Steinhoff, commander of JG-77, later reflected on how this changed Luftwaffe tactics. Every bomber formation had to be assumed to be escorted by Mustangs, whether or not they were visible. Large, coordinated attacks became untenable. Pilots had to engage quickly and with whatever forces were at hand, accepting higher casualty rates and hoping to reach the bombers before being intercepted. The emergence of the Mustang over Berlin coincided with and accelerated a worsening fuel crisis that had long been strangling the Luftwaffe. Germany's reliance on synthetic fuel, produced by converting coal into aviation gasoline through the Burgess hydrogenation process, made the Air Force particularly vulnerable. These industrial complexes were enormous, stationary, and highly susceptible to precision bombing. Prior to March 1944, such plants had largely escaped destruction due to their distance from England, which made accurate bombing without fighter escort nearly impossible. Precision strikes required sustained presence over the target, something bombers could not achieve without protection. Overnight, the Mustang fundamentally altered this strategic calculation. On May 12, 1944, the 8th Air Force mounted its first significant raid on the synthetic fuel facility at Luna, roughly 100 miles southwest of Berlin. A massive formation of 800 bombers, escorted by 735 fighters, including 298 P-51s, dropped 1,718 tons of ordnance with remarkable accuracy. The raid devastated production at Luna, cutting output by 90% almost instantly. By June, Germany's aviation fuel production had plummeted from 175,000 tons per month to just 35,000 tons, and by September it was a mere 7,000 tons, enough to support only around 500 sorties daily across all fronts. Routine training flights were canceled entirely, and inexperienced pilots were being rushed into combat with as little as 50 total hours of flight experience, far below the 250-hour standard of 1942. A veteran transferred from the Eastern Front described the situation as catastrophic. By mid-1944, training flights dwindled to once a week, then monthly, and finally ceased altogether. New arrivals often had no practical experience in firing their weapons, formation flying, or simulated combat. They were, in essence, unprepared for survival against the advanced Allied aircraft. The problem was not just a lack of fuel, it was the erosion of skill, confidence, and operational readiness, the essential qualities of effective fighter pilots. The full impact of the Mustang became undeniable on June 6, 1944, D-Day. The success of the largest amphibious invasion in history required uncontested air superiority over the landing zones. Allied forces conducted 14,674 sorties on that day alone. In contrast, the Luftwaffe managed only 319 sorties and lost 35 aircraft. Over the beaches, a mere 2 German fighters appeared in defense. Oberst Josef Priller, commander of JG-26, led the only Luftwaffe attack on the landing zones. Alongside his wingman, Unterleutnant Heinz Wodarczyk, he carried out a single strafing run on Sword Beach before being driven off by Spitfires. In his memoirs, Priller reflected somberly, "2 planes. That was all we could muster against the largest invasion in history. Not due to a lack of courage, but because we had neither fuel, aircraft, nor air superiority." The dominance of the P-51 Mustangs had already been felt months earlier, not above Normandy, but over the skies of Berlin. Major Vero, who had led the 3.JG-54 and recorded a P-51 kill on May 24, 1944, contemplated the shifting strategic landscape. Once the Mustangs began operations over the German capital, the Luftwaffe lost its capacity to dictate the course of air engagements. From that point onward, German pilots were forced into a reactive stance, constantly defending, perpetually outnumbered. Allied forces could strike virtually anywhere at any moment, always shielded by fighter escorts, while German forces struggled even to protect their own air bases. In essence, the aerial war was effectively lost the instant the Allies could reach Berlin with impunity. In response to this increasingly desperate situation, the Luftwaffe experimented with progressively extreme combat tactics. Among these, the Sturmgruppe assault formations exemplified the extent of their desperation. Standard FW-190A8 fighters were heavily modified. Additional armor plating was added, windshields reinforced, and 30mm cannons mounted to create aircraft that resembled flying armored vehicles. These heavily fortified planes were intended to smash through enemy fighter screens and engage bombers at dangerously close range, maximizing damage before being destroyed. Major Walter Dahl, who assumed command of GG-300 on June 27, 1944, emerged as the most prominent advocate of these tactics. On July 7, 1944, Dahl led IV of Sturmgruppe GG-3, supported by 2 groupings of Bf-109s from GG-300 in a concentrated strike against B-24 liberators near Leipzig. The heavily armored FW-190s succeeded in annihilating an entire 12-plane squadron from the 492nd Bomb Group in under a minute, demonstrating the raw destructive potential of the concept. However, the human and material cost was staggering. Of the Sturmgruppe fighters that took off, 9 were shot down and 3 crash-landed. The accompanying Bf-109s fared even worse against the agile Mustang escorts, highlighting the fleeting and ultimately unsustainable effectiveness of this approach. Oberfeldwebel Konrad Bauer, among the rare pilots to survive multiple Sturmgruppe missions, later described the grim reality. Their aircraft were essentially flying coffins. The added armor, while intended to protect the crews, reduced speeds so drastically that American fighters could make repeated passes with little risk. Pilots were sometimes ordered to ram enemy bombers if their guns failed, but reaching the target through the thick protective screen of escorts was often impossible. Every sortie resembled a game of Russian roulette in which every chamber was loaded. Germany's final hope rested on cutting-edge technology. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. With a top speed of approximately 540 miles per hour, roughly 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51D, it had the potential to shift the air war in Germany's favor. Yet the Me-262 appeared too late and in insufficient numbers. Hitler's insistence on deploying it as a fast bomber rather than as an interceptor fighter further squandered precious time. By the time significant numbers were ready for fighter missions in late 1944, the Luftwaffe faced critical shortages. There was insufficient fuel to train pilots and inadequate infrastructure to operate the jets safely. Adolf Galland, previously dismissed from his position as General der Jagdflieger due to disagreements with Hitler, was appointed to lead JV-44, an elite jet unit formed in February 1945. Even with Germany's most skilled remaining pilots flying the most technologically advanced aircraft in the world, they could not overcome the Allies' overwhelming numerical superiority. Galland himself recalled the futility of these missions. Crews would take off, manage to shoot down one or two bombers or fighters, only to return to find their airfields under immediate attack by Mustang fighters. The war in the air had become a battle of attrition that Germany was no longer capable of winning. German jet fighters faced relentless pressure during the latter stages of World War II. The Me-262s, though technologically advanced, were particularly vulnerable during takeoff and landing, and Allied pilots exploited these moments without mercy. For every minute a German plane remained airborne, American Mustangs dominated the skies overhead for roughly an hour. Advanced machinery, no matter how sophisticated, proved worthless without adequate numbers, trained personnel, and operational support.
By the autumn of 1944, the Luftwaffe was entering a crisis historians would later describe as the collapse of the veteran system. Experienced aces, some credited with dozens or even hundreds of victories, were being lost faster than new pilots could replace them. The introduction of long-range Mustangs into the heart of Germany eliminated any safe zones for training. There were no quiet sectors where rookies could gain necessary experience, leaving replacement pilots exposed to immediate danger. The training figures paint a stark picture. In 1940, a newly commissioned Luftwaffe fighter pilot typically completed around 250 hours of flight instruction before entering combat. By 1944, that figure had been slashed to just 80 hours. As the war progressed into 1945, some pilots were sent into frontline operations after only 20 hours in their aircraft type. In stark contrast, American pilots arriving in England had accumulated 400 to 500 hours of flight experience, including at least 100 hours in their assigned aircraft and extensive live gunnery practice. Johannes Steinhoff, who survived severe burns when his Me-262 crashed during takeoff in April 1945, later reflected on the situation. Inexperienced youths were being sent to die. Pilots barely capable of flying in formation were expected to take on Americans with hundreds of combat hours. Steinhoff called it not combat, but murder. Many Luftwaffe personnel developed the grim habit of avoiding eye contact with replacement pilots, fully aware that most would not survive beyond a week. Casualty statistics confirmed the severity of the crisis. In January 1945, a new fighter pilot could expect to survive only about 7 missions. Entire units sometimes turned over completely in a single month.
JG-301, once considered elite, lost 82 pilots in the first 3 months of 1945 while achieving only 41 confirmed kills. Pilots like Lieutenant G.A., who survived the war with 3 victories, recalled the harsh reality of their early missions. One trainee described a first patrol meant to be instructional, only to be ambushed by Mustangs before formations could be properly established. His flight leader was killed immediately, and he narrowly escaped by diving to treetop level, flying back alone. This served as his combat initiation. While German pilots were being decimated in the air, American bombing campaigns steadily crippled aircraft production. Mustang fighters' long operational range meant no production site in Germany was safe. Factories in Regensburg, Augsburg, Vienna, and Leipzig were repeatedly hit with precision strikes. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production, testified after the war that continuous pressure from Mustang operations forced repeated reconstruction of destroyed facilities. Dispersing production to remote locations, caves, and forests increased costs and reduced efficiency by 75%. Despite producing more aircraft in 1944 than in 1943, the Luftwaffe could not replace its losses quickly enough. Shortages of fuel and trained pilots further compounded the crisis. Production statistics are revealing. September 1944 saw a peak of 3,300 fighters produced, but losses that month alone totaled 3,217. Germany was literally losing planes faster than even the most efficient industrial systems could manufacture them. Moreover, hastily built aircraft from dispersed factories suffered from mechanical issues. Engines failed prematurely, structural weaknesses were common, and weapon systems frequently malfunctioned. Kurt Tank, chief designer of the FW-190, inspected frontline units in December 1944 and was appalled by the defects. Engines intended to last 100 hours often failed after just 10. Control surfaces jammed, and guns were misaligned. The Luftwaffe had effectively transitioned from producing world-class fighters to delivering dangerous, unreliable aircraft. Exhausted workers, substandard materials, and minimal testing contributed to this decline.
Heinz Koka, who had previously written with enthusiasm about defending the Reich, made his final diary entry expressing the despair and futility of the situation. "I have lost countless comrades. Boys I trained, boys I flew alongside, brothers in arms, all gone. For what purpose? We can no longer reach the bombers. The Mustangs dominate the skies. I am no longer a fighter. I am a target awaiting destruction." Luftwaffe records captured after the war illustrate the scale of the losses in stark detail. January 1944, 2,395 operational fighter pilots. June 1944, 1,523 pilots available. January 1945, 742 pilots available. April 1945, approximately 200 pilots still active. Of the Luftwaffe pilots operational at the start of 1944, fewer than 5% survived the war unscathed. The arrival of Mustangs over German territory triggered a near-total annihilation, eradicating an entire generation of experienced aviators. After the conflict, surviving Luftwaffe pilots spoke candidly about the P-51 Mustang's impact. Accounts collected by Allied intelligence and later historians reveal the profound psychological and strategic collapse. Adolphe Galland, despite his wartime disputes with Nazi leadership, remained a respected authority on the Luftwaffe's downfall. In a 1954 interview, he stated, "The P-51 Mustang was the game-changer in the air war over Germany. It wasn't the top fighter in every metric. The Spitfire had tighter turns, the FW-190 rolled faster, the Me-262 had more speed, but the Mustang was highly competent in all areas and could operate anywhere. Once it appeared over Berlin, we realized the war was effectively lost. It was like facing a chessboard where your opponent suddenly has queens with unrestricted movement. Johannes Steinhoff, who survived severe burns when his Me-262 crashed during takeoff in April 1945, and later became Chief of Staff of the post-war German Air Force, as well as NATO Military Committee Chairman, offered a similar assessment. The Mustang didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it dismantled the very concept of German air superiority. Our entire defensive doctrine relied on the belief that Germany itself was beyond the range of single-engine fighters. That assumption was shattered, and with it, our strategy collapsed. The defeat was not merely tactical, it was a strategic disaster from which the Luftwaffe never recovered.
By the war's end, the P-51 Mustang had not only destroyed aircraft and pilots, it had effectively annihilated Germany's ability to control its skies, leaving a permanent mark on the history of aerial warfare. One of the most striking accounts comes from Heinz Koch, who had meticulously documented the trajectory of the war in his diary, from initial optimism to eventual despair. During a 1975 reunion of former combatants, Koch encountered Colonel Clarence "Bud" Anderson, a triple-ace pilot who had flown P-51 Mustangs with the 357th Fighter Group. Koch reflected, quote, "When your Mustangs first appeared over Berlin, it was as if the horizon had stretched infinitely. We had been reassured that victory was within reach and that America's distance rendered them harmless. Yet suddenly, your aircraft were above our capital, fully fueled and unchallenged. That moment shattered more than our willingness to fight. It undermined our trust in everything we had been told." End quote. Erich Hartmann, the top-scoring Luftwaffe ace with 352 confirmed kills, survived the Mustang onslaught by devising highly cautious combat tactics. He would strike only when he had overwhelming advantages and would immediately disengage if Mustangs were spotted. In interviews after the war, Hartmann explained, quote, "Engaging Mustangs was unlike any aerial combat we had known. It was a matter of survival. They held every possible advantage: superior numbers, altitude, fuel endurance, and increasingly skilled pilots. Our only hope was to endure and perhaps catch an isolated opponent by surprise." End quote. The operational impact of the P-51 Mustang in the European theater is starkly evident in the statistics, illustrating both the effectiveness of the American air campaign and the scale of German defeat. P-51 pilots claimed 4,950 aerial victories, while an additional 4,131 enemy aircraft were destroyed on the ground, accounting for nearly half, 48.9%, of all U.S. fighter claims in Europe. Loss rates further underscore the Mustang's dominance. P-51 suffered a mere 1.2% loss per mission, while German fighters endured 18% losses per sortie by 1945, giving an overall kill ratio of roughly 3.6 to 1 in favor of the P-51. The arrival of the Mustang also dramatically improved bomber survivability. Before its deployment, bomber crews faced a 9.1% chance of loss per mission. Afterward, losses dropped to 2.5%, reducing casualties among crews by more than 2/3. The Mustang's extended range revolutionized escort operations. While the P-47 Thunderbolt could cover 375 miles and the P-38 Lightning 450 miles, the P-51B/C reached 650 miles and the P-51D up to 750 miles with drop tanks, effectively placing all of Germany within reach of American fighter protection. Production capacity further amplified the Mustang's impact. A total of 15,686 P-51s were built, with peak output reaching 320 aircraft per month, each costing $51,000 in 1945. By comparison, Germany produced 25,860 fighters in 1944, yet at any given time, fewer than 1,500 were operational. Pilot quality and attrition were also decisive factors. American pilots arriving in Europe in 1944 to 1945 averaged 400 flight hours, while their German counterparts entered combat with only 80. The Luftwaffe's survival rate for these late-war pilots fell below 15%, whereas 65% of American fighter pilots completed their tour.
The sight of Mustangs above Berlin signaled more than a tactical advantage. It represented a transformative shift in the nature of air warfare. For the first time, a single nation could exert uncontested air power across the entire territory of a major adversary. General Karl Spaatz, commanding the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, summarized the effect in his after-action report. The P-51 Mustang gave us not merely air superiority, but absolute air supremacy. By spring 1944, we could strike any target at any time while maintaining acceptable losses. This was not simply a military edge, it became a psychological instrument. German morale, both civilian and military, collapsed as they realized no location was beyond reach. The Mustang triggered cascading strategic effects. Industrial production slowed as factories had to hide or disperse. Transportation infrastructure was repeatedly disrupted, and the already fragile German economy began to disintegrate. Synthetic fuel facilities, previously secure, were systematically destroyed, accelerating the fuel crisis and compounding the collapse. A destructive feedback loop emerged within the Luftwaffe. Diminishing fuel supplies meant fewer opportunities for pilot training, which in turn led to greater combat losses. These losses further constrained fuel allocation, exacerbating the crisis. Dominance in the skies. Once the Luftwaffe was driven from the air, Allied ground operations gained unprecedented freedom. The Normandy breakout, the rapid advance through France, and the crossing of the Rhine were all feasible because German forces were largely restricted to nighttime movement. Psychological impact. The sight of American fighters over Berlin shattered the illusion of German invulnerability. Citizens, long fed propaganda portraying the United States as distant and weak, watched sleek silver P-51 Mustangs patrol the skies unchallenged. At the start of the war, Germany held clear technological advantages in several areas. In 1939, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 was arguably the premier fighter aircraft worldwide. German aviators were exceptionally skilled, many having honed their abilities in the Spanish Civil War. Their tactics, especially the Finger 4 formation and energy-based dogfighting, were ahead of their time. However, the P-51 Mustang represented a fundamentally different approach. It combined British engineering innovation with the Merlin engine, American industrial capacity, and automotive-style mass production techniques. Continuous adaptation informed by real combat experience ensured that improvements were rapid and practical. Unlike a design born of a single visionary, the Mustang was the result of collective refinement.
When the P-51D began deployment in May 1944, it incorporated multiple combat-driven enhancements: a bubble canopy for full visibility, 6 .50 caliber machine guns with improved ammunition feed, the K-14 computing gun sight, reinforced wings for heavier ordnance, better radio equipment, and the Packard-built V1650-7 engine generating 1,590 horsepower. Each upgrade directly responded to battlefield needs as reported by pilots. This iterative cycle, combat experience fueling design improvement, which in turn enhanced operational effectiveness, was something the German system, hindered by fragmented leadership and production bottlenecks, could not emulate. After the war, Dr. Kurt Tank, designer of the FW-190, acknowledged, "We could create aircraft comparable or superior to the Mustang. The TA-152H in particular had superior specifications, but producing them in quantity, ensuring consistent fuel supply, and adequately training pilots was beyond our capacity." The American strategy went beyond building a superior aircraft. It created an efficient system for design, production, and deployment. German reactions exposed systemic weaknesses. Instead of recognizing the Mustang's threat, Nazi leadership denied reality. Hitler insisted on bomber production rather than fighter prioritization. Experienced pilots were flown until death rather than preserved as instructors. Honest assessments were suppressed, with senior officers punished for delivering inconvenient truths. The consequences for Germany's elite pilots were stark. Aces, the face of Luftwaffe prestige, were eliminated systematically. Major Klaus Mitusch, with 72 victories, perished on September 17, 1944, after 452 missions intercepted by Mustangs while preparing an attack. Oberst Walter Ossow, credited with 123 kills, was downed by P-38s on May 11, 1944. Even before the mass arrival of Mustangs, the quality of German pilots was deteriorating, allowing earlier American fighters to inflict significant losses. Major Hans Philipp, with 206 kills, fell to P-47s on October 8, 1943. By war's end, 95 of the 107 German pilots with 100 or more victories were dead, captured, or severely wounded. The Mustang had not merely defeated the Luftwaffe in the air, it had eradicated its institutional knowledge. By 1945, the Luftwaffe existed more on paper than in reality. Planes were hidden in forests, disguised on fake farms, or dispersed along roads. Pilots moved constantly, living in fear. Oberst Gordon Golob, one of the few surviving senior commanders, issued desperate operational directives. Planes would only take off when enemy bombers were overhead. Maximum sortie time was limited to 15 minutes. Pilots remaining in the air beyond 20 minutes were presumed defectors. Fear of Mustangs became so profound that many German aviators aborted missions at the first hint of American escorts. Courts-martials for cowardice increased, though executing the few experienced pilots left was strategically counterproductive. Morale disintegrated further as German pilots realized that even successful missions had negligible effect. Allied bombers persisted. Mustangs continued to escort them, and German casualties mounted relentlessly. Lieutenant Heinrich Bartels, with 99 confirmed kills, was shot down on December 23, 1944, one victory short of becoming a century ace. 6 Mustangs attacked from above and behind, ensuring no chance of survival. Earlier in the war, aerial combat followed a form of restrained engagement. Pilots often refrained from attacking parachuting opponents or withdrawing aircraft. By 1945, American airmen, acutely aware of their friends' losses and the war's imminent conclusion, adopted an uncompromising approach. Every German pilot killed represented one less aviator capable of operating advanced aircraft that Germany was still developing. Accounts from American Mustang pilots illustrate the campaign's progression. Colonel John C. Meyer, a 24-victory ace, noted that from March to June 1944, they faced the Luftwaffe's seasoned frontline pilots. By June to December, the Luftwaffe's secondary line emerged, still skilled but less organized. By 1945, American pilots engaged largely inexperienced, barely capable aviators. Lieutenant Colonel John B. England of the 302nd Fighter Squadron emphasized that the Mustang's significance extended beyond range. It imposed psychological dominance. German pilots knew that encountering Mustangs often meant death. Early in the war, they had fought aggressively even when outnumbered. By late 1944, they retreated at first sight. By 1945, many did not even take off. Captain Charles "Chuck" Yeager, who would later make history by surpassing the sound barrier, recorded 11.5 confirmed aerial victories flying P-51 Mustangs. His evaluation of the aircraft was candid and straightforward. The Mustang was a reliable, predictable fighter. It did not hide flaws if handled correctly,
and it rewarded pilots who respected its design. Confronted with German fighters in 1944 and 1945, Mustangs offered a decisive edge. Speed, range, altitude, and superior numbers made engagements one-sided. It wasn't a fair contest, Yeager noted, but fairness is rarely part of war. The appreciation for the P-51 extended beyond the fighter pilots to those whose survival depended on them. Bomber crews in particular recognized the profound difference these escorts made. Technical Sergeant William McManus with the 100th Bomb Group recalled the peril of earlier missions. Before the Mustangs, sorties often felt like walking into certain death. Watching their previous escorts turn back left crews exposed to enemy attacks. Once Mustangs began accompanying bombers all the way to their targets and back, the perception changed drastically. It was as if guardian angels were watching over us, McManus reflected. Losses dropped dramatically. The likelihood of returning safely soared. The P-51's battlefield dominance was matched by an equally impressive industrial achievement. North American Aviation's factories in Englewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, reached production levels that seemed unattainable by German standards. At the height of output in 1944, a complete Mustang rolled off the assembly line every 63 minutes. This feat was enabled by assembly line techniques borrowed from the automotive industry, which divided the manufacturing process into highly specialized tasks.
Workers, many of whom had never assembled an aircraft before, quickly became experts in their assigned roles. Housewives installed control cables, teenagers riveted wing panels, and older men took on engine assembly. Within weeks, they produced aircraft meeting rigorous quality standards, with inspection built into every stage. If a flaw was discovered, production halted until corrections were made. Paul Peters, a production supervisor at Englewood, described the system as both meticulous and remarkably efficient. In stark contrast, German aircraft production suffered from dispersal and resource constraints caused by Allied bombing. Factories were relocated to caves, forests, and abandoned mines, with components sometimes manufactured hundreds of miles apart. Quality control was nearly impossible, and many workers were forced laborers, often motivated to resist production. General Dietrich Rohrbach, who commanded several Luftwaffe units during the war, recalled receiving aircraft that looked flawless but were in fact dangerous. Controls were miswired, fuel lines leaked, and guns frequently malfunctioned. Meanwhile, American planes were superior in both design and execution, assembled by people committed to victory. We were building inferior machines with crews that sometimes hoped we would fail. The P-51's operational impact extended well beyond Europe. Its ability to escort bombers deep into enemy territory showed that air power could be projected over long distances, signaling a new era of global reach. Japan took note as its defensive perimeter contracted under the threat of long-range American fighters. The Soviet Union, too, observed closely. Soviet pilots who flew Lend-Lease Mustangs were impressed by their endurance and dependability, prompting the Soviet Air Force to experiment with long-range escort fighters. Although they tested 10 P-51s extensively, these aircraft were never deployed in combat by Soviet forces. The Mustang's service did not end with World War II. Renamed the F-51 in 1948, it flew close support missions during the Korean War. The Israeli Air Force relied on Mustangs during the 1956 Suez Crisis. Various air forces kept Mustangs operational into the 1980s. The Dominican Air Force retired its final F-51D in 1984, marking 40 years since the aircraft first soared over Berlin. Beyond its longevity, the Mustang's greatest influence was doctrinal. It demonstrated that true air superiority was not merely about dominating the skies above a battlefield, but about controlling the airspace over entire nations. Modern air forces continue to structure their strategies around this principle, first proven when American P-51s appeared over Berlin on March 6, 1944. Underlying these technological and strategic achievements were the young men, mostly in their early 20s, who faced extraordinary risks daily. They operated these machines under extreme conditions, their skill and courage amplifying the capabilities of the aircraft and shaping the course of aerial warfare. The sight of American P-51 Mustangs flying over Berlin carried profound significance, though its meaning differed dramatically depending on who witnessed it. For the U.S. pilots, it was a confirmation of their efforts and a moment of immense pride. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group described in a letter home the experience of flying over the German capital. They had taken off from England, crossed the heart of Germany, circled Berlin as if it were their own airspace, and returned safely. He reflected on the dramatic contrast. 2 years prior, German bombers had been devastating London, and now the situation was reversed. The sense of accomplishment, coupled with the realization that victory was within reach, was overwhelming. For German aviators, however, the same scene was a harbinger of despair. Feldwebel Rudi Müller of JG 302 wrote to his wife, recounting the shock of seeing these single-engine American fighters above Berlin. The fact that they could reach the city meant no corner of Germany was beyond enemy reach. His words conveyed fear and resignation, an acknowledgement that much of what he had believed about the war's progress was no longer true, and that his survival was uncertain. Civilians in Berlin began to face the collapse of long-held illusions. Ursula von Kardorff, writing in her diary, noted that the German population had been taught that the Americans were weak and divided, incapable of challenging Germany's might. Yet, observing the Mustangs overhead while the Luftwaffe was absent shattered that narrative. The lies they had been told now stood exposed, and with them the sense of invulnerability instilled by propaganda. Among Allied bomber crews, the arrival of the Mustangs was nothing short of life-saving. Staff Sergeant James McMahon, serving as a ball turret gunner on B-17 Lucky Lady, recalled being moved to tears when American fighters joined their formation en route to Berlin. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe he could survive his missions. The long-range escort provided by the Mustangs drastically reduced casualties, preserving countless lives that might otherwise have been lost. By the end of the war, the impact of the Mustang on the Luftwaffe and the broader conflict was undeniable. Germany's once feared air force had been systematically destroyed as an effective fighting entity. Between 1944 and 1945, the Luftwaffe lost roughly 45,000 aircraft and 15,000 pilots. Less than 5% of the pilots who were operational in early 1944 survived uninjured. German cities suffered massive destruction, with over 60 urban centers experiencing more than 50% devastation, while civilian casualties from Allied bombing ranged between 350,000 and 500,000. Industrial output was cut by 35 to 40%. These numbers reflect not only military defeat, but a profound breakdown of society. The Mustang enabled sustained attacks on every German urban center, industrial facility, and airfield, eliminating any concept of a safe rear area. Even Hermann Göring, notoriously skilled at denial, admitted during the Nuremberg trials that the moment American fighters appeared over Berlin marked the effective end of Germany's war effort. Everything that followed, he acknowledged, was only prolonging the inevitable, resulting in more unnecessary deaths.
The P-51 itself was a marvel of rapid innovation and adaptation. The NA-73X prototype first flew on October 26, 1940, only 102 days after the British Purchasing Commission had issued its request to North American aviation. By March 1944, fewer than 4 years later, the aircraft was escorting bombers deep into German territory. Each successive model incorporated combat lessons. Early Allison engines limited altitude performance, but the P-51B/C, equipped with the Packard Merlin F-1650-3 engine, dramatically improved high-altitude capabilities.
The P-51D added a bubble canopy, 6 guns, and further upgraded systems, while the P-51H achieved peak performance but did not see combat in Europe. This feedback loop of frontline experience driving design improvements allowed American industry to outpace German aircraft development, which suffered from fragmented leadership, disrupted production, and the inability to implement combat-driven refinements. Although German engineers produced technically advanced aircraft, including the Ta-152H and the Me-262, they could not deploy them in sufficient numbers or iterate quickly based on operational lessons. In contrast, the Mustang validated the strategic bombing doctrine long theorized by pre-war visionaries like Billy Mitchell and Julio Doet. Until long-range escorts like the P-51 were available, daylight precision bombing was impractical. With the Mustang, Allied forces could strike specific targets, ball-bearing factories, synthetic fuel plants, aircraft assembly buildings, with accuracy, complementing the British strategy of night area bombing. The difference in precision and impact was decisive, cementing the Mustang's place as a pivotal instrument in the Allied victory. During World War II, British nighttime bombing raids typically achieved a circular error of roughly 3 miles, reflecting the difficulty of hitting specific targets under the cover of darkness. In contrast, American daytime bombing operations, protected by long-range fighter escorts, could reach an accuracy of about 1,000 feet. General Curtis LeMay, who would later command the Strategic Air Command, emphasized the transformative impact of these escorts, particularly the P-51 Mustang. The introduction of the Mustang fundamentally changed strategic bombing. Without it, we faced a choice between unsustainable losses or largely ineffective night raids. With it, we could systematically target and dismantle Germany's industrial capacity. The effect of this precise aerial strategy was profound. German production of ball bearings dropped by 70%, aviation fuel output fell by 95%, synthetic rubber decreased by 85%, railroad transport declined by 75%, and canal transport in Western Germany was brought to a halt. By combining escort fighters with heavy bombers, the Allies executed a form of industrial disruption that has been described as surgical. Each destroyed factory, derailed train, or incinerated fuel depot directly impaired the German war effort, shortening the conflict by months or even years. The sight of Mustang fighters patrolling the skies over Berlin became emblematic of Allied dominance, ranking alongside iconic images such as the flag raising on Iwo Jima or Soviet troops at the Reichstag. To Americans, the P-51 symbolized the nation's industrial ingenuity and technological leadership. Its development and rapid deployment, accomplished by a company without prior experience in fighter production, embodied the spirit of American resourcefulness and determination. War bond posters, Hollywood films, and post-war commemorations celebrated this technological marvel as a symbol of national pride. For Germans, however, the Mustangs represented humiliation and defeat. Post-war accounts in literature and cinema frequently depict American fighters looming over German cities as a testament to the Luftwaffe's failure to defend the homeland. Veterans recalled the deep psychological scars left by the inability to contest air superiority. Heinz Koka, writing in 1953, reflected that a fighter pilot's highest duty is the protection of one's own skies. For many German pilots, the Mustangs over Berlin were a visible confirmation of that duty unfulfilled, a source of lasting shame.
From a military strategic perspective, the P-51 offers lessons that remain relevant today. Its effectiveness stemmed not from individual heroics alone, but from integration within a comprehensive system of bombers, intelligence, logistics, and training. Germany possessed advanced aircraft and skilled pilots, yet it lacked the coordination to leverage these assets efficiently. Production capacity was equally decisive. While German fighters were technically impressive, the sheer number of American aircraft overwhelmed them. Pilot training amplified the Mustang's potential. U.S. programs emphasized both flight hours and realistic combat experience, ensuring operators could exploit the plane's capabilities fully. Adaptability also proved critical. American forces continuously refined tactics, improved technology, and adjusted training based on battlefield experience. In contrast, German doctrine remained rigid, constrained by political interference and an inability to innovate quickly. Modern air forces still draw from these principles. Strategic flexibility relies on long-range strike options, integrated air defense, sustained industrial production, and highly trained personnel. The P-51's first appearance over Berlin on March 6, 1944, marked more than a tactical achievement. It shattered the German belief that their capital was untouchable. The Reich had assumed that distance, elite pilots, and advanced fighters would safeguard the city. The Mustangs proved that assumption false within a single morning, delivering a psychological as well as strategic blow. German leadership realized that their calculations about American industrial and technological inferiority were fundamentally wrong. Adolf Galland later stated, "March 6, 1944 was the day the war was lost, not the fall of Berlin, not Hitler's death, but the day American fighters arrived over our capital." What followed was only the inevitable conclusion. In the end, the Mustang did more than defeat the Luftwaffe in aerial combat. It demonstrated the unparalleled combination of industrial capacity, technological innovation, and skilled personnel inherent in the American war machine. It exemplified how integrated systems, rapid adaptation, and sustained production could achieve a strategic revolution, lessons that continue to inform air power doctrine today. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang over German cities sent shockwaves through the population and the Nazi leadership. If Berlin itself could not be safeguarded from these American fighters, then what could the regime protect? For years, the German people had been told that the Allies were weak, that American air power was limited and ineffectual. The Mustang shattered that illusion, exposing the reality that much of the Nazi narrative was a fabrication. It was not merely an aircraft in combat, it became an unintentional symbol of truth, demonstrating the fragility of a worldview built on lies. The operational success of the Mustang was decisive, but it was far from cost-free. Throughout the European campaign, 2,520 P-51s were lost in action. Behind each destroyed aircraft was a young pilot who would never return home. The 357th Fighter Group alone saw more than 100 of its aviators killed in combat. These were among the most talented and dedicated men the United States could offer, college graduates, athletes, and professionals who had volunteered for the rigors of aerial warfare. Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Brooks, leading the 339th Fighter Group, was struck down on March 31, 1944, when flak damaged his P-51B near Brunswick. He was only 28, survived by a wife and 2 children he would never see grow up. His fate was tragically repeated across the air war in Europe, underscoring the human cost behind every strategic achievement.
Even those who survived the war often faced lingering danger. Captain Don Gentili, one of the Mustang's most accomplished aces with over 21 confirmed aerial victories, survived combat only to die in a peacetime accident in January 1951 while testing a T-33 jet. Many Mustang pilots carried invisible scars from what they witnessed and the choices they had to make. Their mental and emotional burdens endured long after the guns fell silent. Yet, their efforts yielded a profound result. They brought the fight directly to German soil, forcing the Luftwaffe into a defensive posture over its own cities, and achieved air supremacy. The Luftwaffe never fully recovered from the psychological and material blow inflicted by the Mustangs over Berlin. From that point onward, it was a shadow of its former self, unable to mount effective or sustained resistance. By dawn on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, American P-51s patrolled German skies without encountering any meaningful opposition. The once feared Luftwaffe, which had dominated European airspace in 1940, had effectively ceased to exist. Its aircraft were destroyed or grounded due to fuel shortages. Its pilots were killed, captured, or injured, and its bases lay in ruins. The transformation from March 6, 1944 to May 8, 1945, a span of just 14 months, represents one of the most comprehensive and rapid air victories in military history. During this period, the P-51 Mustang became the linchpin of Allied air power. Mustang pilots flew over 213,000 sorties, claiming nearly 5,000 aerial victories, destroying more than 4,000 enemy aircraft on the ground, dropping 31,000 tons of bombs, and expending nearly 100 million rounds of ammunition. Behind these staggering figures lay the reality of young American men, typically around 22 years old, flying lightweight aluminum fighters powered by Packard-built Merlin engines, decisively dismantling one of history's most formidable air forces. Their victories were not solely the result of individual heroism, though countless acts of bravery occurred, but stemmed from superior engineering, rigorous training, disciplined tactics, and massive industrial support. Colonel Hubert Zenke, among the most successful fighter leaders of the war, described the Luftwaffe as formidable adversaries, overwhelmed by sheer numbers and resources. The Allies had more aircraft, more pilots, greater training, extended operational range, and superior logistical backing. The Mustang allowed American forces to project that advantage anywhere, and once escorted missions reached Berlin, victory became mathematically inevitable. For pilots like Major Hans Kogler, who witnessed the first Mustangs over Brandenburg on March 6, 1944, the aircraft represented more than just enemy opposition. It was a glimpse into the future of air combat. The Mustang proved that distance could be neutralized by technology, that industrial output could surpass individual skill, and that meticulous planning and strategy could outmatch improvisation and localized brilliance. In the end, the P-51 Mustang was far more than a plane. It was a strategic instrument that reshaped the European air war, exacting a heavy toll on both men and material, but achieving a decisive victory that fundamentally altered the course of history. The combined impact of human courage, technological innovation, and industrial might culminated in a force that was not only lethal, but psychologically transformative, breaking the Luftwaffe and symbolizing the unstoppable advance of Allied air power.
The German aviators who first spotted P-51 Mustangs over Berlin were confronting more than just a faster, more agile fighter. They were witnessing the tangible expression of America's industrial might, technological innovation, and logistical organization projected across thousands of miles directly into the heart of the Reich. This was not merely an encounter between aircraft, it was a demonstration that redefined the limits of air warfare and forced a re-evaluation of long-held assumptions about strategic power. Hermann Göring later admitted that seeing these American fighters above Berlin convinced him that the war was effectively lost. This admission has become a historical touchstone for recognizing defeat, yet the significance of that moment extends far beyond one leader's realization or the fall of one nation. The arrival of Mustangs over the German capital marked a turning point in military history, the era when air power became truly decisive, when industrial output overshadowed traditional combat valor, and when systematic efficiency outweighed individual heroism. For the Luftwaffe pilots who faced these silver fighters, it was a confrontation with their own obsolescence. Within little over a year, their air force would be annihilated, Germany would be occupied, and the ideology they fought to defend would collapse. The Mustang over Berlin was a harbinger of that outcome, signaling a broader shift in how wars would be waged in the modern era. Precision, reach, and overwhelming force had become defining factors, and the U.S. had demonstrated all three with lethal clarity. The P-51 Mustang was more than a bomber escort or a dogfighter. Its impact was psychological, strategic, and symbolic. It shattered the narrative of Aryan supremacy, disproved myths of invincible national destiny, and illustrated that democracies, despite internal complexities and apparent disorder, could outproduce and outorganize totalitarian regimes. Geography and defensive fortifications, once considered decisive advantages, were rendered insufficient against a nation that could marshal technological and industrial power on a global scale. On March 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe pilots who watched those Mustangs roar overhead experienced the beginning of the end.
In less than 14 months, their air fleet would be destroyed, leaving Germany defenseless from the skies and signaling the collapse of the Third Reich's military infrastructure. The spectacle of American fighters above Berlin catalyzed a sequence of realizations, exposing the limits of Nazi power and revealing the transformative potential of modern air warfare. Today, P-51 Mustangs are preserved in air shows, their Merlin engines unmistakable to those who flew in the 1940s. For American veterans, their roar recalls triumph. For German veterans, it recalls the first undeniable sign of defeat. Historians see in that sound a marker of a strategic revolution, the moment when a nation proved it could project decisive air power anywhere on the globe, reshaping the nature of military conflict for generations. The story of shocked Luftwaffe pilots is ultimately a story of reality colliding with expectation, of technological might overcoming ideology, and of industry triumphing over bravado. When American Mustangs appeared over Berlin, they unsettled not only the pilots who faced them, but the very worldview that had sustained the Nazi war effort. Yet from that upheaval emerged a post-war transformation. Many surviving German pilots would go on to serve in the air forces of a democratic Germany, working alongside the former adversaries whose aircraft had destroyed their comrades. Johannes Steinhoff, for instance, rose to become chief of staff of the new Luftwaffe and later chairman of NATO's military committee, standing in solidarity with American officers who had once engaged him in combat. This transition, from mortal enemies to partners in a defensive alliance, represents perhaps the most profound legacy of the Mustangs over Berlin. The aircraft did not merely deliver destruction, they also helped lay the groundwork for liberation, rebuilding, and the establishment of a stable, democratic Germany. Pilots like Adolf Galland, who survived the Mustang onslaught, later reflected on this transformation. At a 1984 reunion in San Antonio, he toasted his former adversaries, acknowledging that the shock of seeing American aircraft in 1944 had ultimately given way to a deeper, unexpected shock, the construction of peace and friendship from the ruins of war. The appearance of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin did not simply alter a battle, it catalyzed a global shift in strategy and international relations. These aircraft not only destroyed the Luftwaffe's effectiveness, but demonstrated the superiority of industrialized, technologically advanced warfare. They presaged a new era in which modern air power could shape not only the outcome of conflicts, but the political architecture of post-war Europe. The shocked pilots of March 1944 could scarcely imagine that the very forces that devastated them would, within decades, help secure their nation's democratic reintegration and guarantee its place among free nations. In this sense, the Mustang's greatest triumph was not measured in aerial kills or escorted bombers, but in the lasting peace they helped make possible. They transformed destruction into liberation, defeat into renewal, and animosity into alliance. 8 decades later, the legacy of those P-51 Mustangs endures, not merely as symbols of wartime victory, but as agents of a strategic and moral order that shaped the modern world. The skies over Berlin in March 1944 marked more than a turning point in a war. They heralded the dawn of a new global paradigm in which air power, technology, and organized industrial might became the ultimate arbiters of national fate.